Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for that very nice introduction. Thank you, President Reichman. Thank you, judges who are here, chief justices and former judges and justices and professors, and my goodness, what am I going to say? I don't know. I think of something. What I wanted to talk to you, and students. Let's not forget the students. They're going to be, and yeah, all right. Thank you. And this is, where's the, no, that's my passport. Where is the document? The Constitution of the United States. That's what I'm going to talk about. And I was thinking, here it is, not very long, 35 small pages. And they wrote this document, the founders, in the last part of the 18th century, and it stood up pretty well. 27 amendments, not very many. There's a lot I could talk about, I guess, but I have been thinking about what? What is a point to make that you might find somewhat relevant and will not get me away from the document that I'm talking about, which is the United States Constitution, not some other constitution or problems in other countries. And I'm not representing the administration, and I'm not representing anybody except someone who's worked for 40 years, really, counting the Court of Appeals, with this document. All right, what? And I think perhaps the most interesting question and difficult question about this document I got put to me by a woman who was, and I don't know if she is still, the Chief Justice of Ghana. And she had been trying to get more civil rights and human rights protected and democracy and so forth. And she came to Washington, and we were in my office and having a cup of coffee, and she said, I have one question. I said, what? What is your question? She said, why do people do what you say? Not such a bad question. I mean, the 9 of us, and maybe if you count all the judges in America, maybe there are 9,000, there are an awful lot of them. But why? And how would I answer that question? And what I said was, well, it's a question of habit, it's a question of mores, it's a question of what you learn and how you're brought up and all those things. But that's just words. What can I tell you? Let me give you some examples, and then you'll see how difficult this is, your question. And the first example that I wanted to give her is pretty well known. They teach this case in the law schools around the 1830s, 1840s, about the Cherokee Indians, because we had a treaty with the Cherokee Indian tribe, the United States, and northern Georgia belonged to them. Okay? I don't mean the country Georgia, I mean the state Georgia. Okay. It belonged to them. And then, very unfortunately for them, gold was discovered on their land. And so the Georgians thought, well, why should the Indians have the gold? We should have it, of course. And so they marched in and said, now the law of Georgia is going to apply here. Now, this was a very civilized tribe. Indeed, probably more than the Georgians. So what does a civilized group of people do when they're in this situation? It's obvious, isn't it? They hire a lawyer. And that's what they did. The best lawyer of the day, Willard Wirtz, he was great. And it was tough getting to the Supreme Court for a number of technical reasons, which I'll spare you, but they finally got there. In the case of Worcester versus Georgia, and the Supreme Court said, of course, this land belongs to the Indians. It does not belong to the Georgians. And that is well known in the United States for this reason, because it is about that decision that the President of the United States, Andrew Jackson, said, supposedly, John Marshall, the Chief Justice, has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. Yeah, that's right. And indeed, after much, Andrew Jackson sent armed forces to northern Georgia, but not to enforce the decision, but to kick out the Indians, which they did. And they marched along the Trail of Tears all the way to Oklahoma, where their descendants live to this day. And Marshall and Story communicated, Story, another justice, well known on the court, they said, little hope for this document. Little hope. Well, lots of water went under the bridge. Is that where it goes? Over the dam? I don't know. But anyway, time passed. I mean, the president discovered he couldn't run his country that way, because the next thing that happened is that South Carolina said, what a good idea Georgia has. We think we won't send them our customs duty that finances the federal government. All right, you can see the kind of thing that happened, but more than that happened. I mean, after all, we go across the years and we see a civil war and we see slavery in the South gradually coming to an end. And then we see Reconstruction, and Reconstruction meant, yes, slavery's at an end. We will just have segregation, racial segregation. And, black people will not be treated. We'll say they're treating them the same. Ha, ha, ha. Anyone who opened his eyes would discover, of course, they weren't being treated the same. And nobody did anything about it. But wait. Yes. In 1954, quite a long time later, after about 70 or 80 years of racial segregation, the Supreme Court of the United States, with a new Chief Justice, Earl Warren, ruled that racial segregation is not equal. See, the Constitution says equal protection of the laws. That isn't equal, and therefore it violates the Constitution. That's what the Supreme Court said. And by the way, when the old Chief Justice, I shouldn't tell you this, but when the old Chief Justice died and Warren was appointed, Justice Frankfurter, who was a great judge, supposedly said at the funeral, "Now I know there is a God." So anyway, they said no more segregation. Goodbye. The end. That was 1954. And you know what happened in 1955? Oh, you obviously do. Nothing. You say? You said nothing? And that's what happened. Nothing. Or next to nothing. 1956? Yeah, nothing. Again, double nothing. And there we are. But in 1957, a judge who was visiting from South Dakota, actually was visiting Little Rock, Arkansas, and he wrote out, you segregate Central High School, you will change that and integrate Central High School in Little Rock next September. Now, you may know the story. It's a well-known story. And the Little Rock Nine, those 9 brave black children, organized by the NAACP, got ready to go into that high school. And there they were. And the press was there. And the press took pictures. And one of them, you may still know, a picture of Hazel Bryant, the white girl, and it was a black girl is walking out because she can't get in because all the white citizen councils are all surrounding the schools. And Elizabeth Eckford is reading her book, and that picture went around the world, and it wasn't a happy picture for the United States of America. And Governor Falbus of Arkansas, a leading segregationist, said, well, maybe these people have a court order, but I have the state police. But the congressman from Little Rock, Hayes Brooks, arranged a meeting between Governor Falbus and President Eisenhower in at the summer White House. And he went up there, Falbus, he wanted to see Eisenhower, and he said to Eisenhower, I'll let them in the school, I'll let them in the school. And then he walked outside the door and told the press the opposite. Well, that made Eisenhower a little angry. So Eisenhower took advice. What should I do? And Jimmy Burns, who'd been on the Supreme Court and had resigned during World War II to run the domestic economic effort during the war, he said, if you send troops, you have to be prepared for a second Reconstruction. You will have to occupy the South. Are you ready for that? And then he said the best that could happen is they'll close all the schools. Okay? And no one will be educated. But Eisenhower's wise counselor, Herbert Brownell, said to him, you've got to do it. You've got to do something. You can't have a country without a rule of law. And he did. He got 1,000 paratroopers from Fort Bragg who were the 101st Airborne. Everybody then, at that time, knew who those people were. They were the ones who'd been in the Normandy invasion and had got hung up on the church steeples and shot down, and they were the heroes of the Battle of the Bulge. He knew what he was doing, and he picked them. They went with those 9 students, the paratroopers, and they walked them into the school. So we have a happy ending. We have a happy ending. Rule of law, integration, equal treatment. I forgot one thing. I forgot that they couldn't stay there forever, those paratroopers. And so when they walked out, a new school board passed a new rule in Little Rock and said segregation works better. So all the black students should come out of the school. And of course, there was a new case for the Supreme Court called Cooper versus Aaron. And when it got to the Supreme Court, all 9 justices signed the opinion, which is very rare, doesn't happen very often, and said, integrate tomorrow, bring them back. Yeah, okay, we've got it. 9 people. 9 people. Mm-hmm. Maybe 900, maybe 9,000. But we're talking about the entire South. Is that? And so what happened the day after that opinion came down? Governor Faubus closed the school. And so read what happened during that year. Margolick wrote a book on it. He's a good journalist. And Hazel Bryant tried to become, it's a long story, but no one was educated. And it was a bad year for everyone in that school and really affected their lives, white and black alike. No education. Very tough problem. Tough problem. And so what will happen? And so I said, well, everybody can have his own views. Everybody can, but I think it was too late when they did that. Because by that time, the rest of the country had awakened to what was going on in the South. And they had seen a few pictures of those schools for black children, which, not great. And we had the era of Martin Luther King. And we had the Birmingham bus boycott. And we had the Freedom Riders. And they went to the South. And the country said, no. No. Enough of them. So that school couldn't stay closed. Just couldn't happen. But I said to the woman from Ghana, you see what I want you to see? Very few, certainly not a majority, of the people who went to the South, the people who went to the Martin Luther King rallies, the people who were part of the Freedom Riders and so forth, they weren't lawyers. They weren't lawyers. And they were the ones. And I once asked Vernon Jordan, who was a big civil rights leader at the time, I said, do you think the Supreme Court really mattered? I mean, wasn't it World War II? And wasn't it the movement towards equality? And wasn't it the communication that showed people what was going on? Isn't that what mattered? He said, yes, of course those things mattered, but believe me, the Supreme Court mattered too. That was the catalyst. And nothing would have happened without it for a long time. That was his view. So I said, okay. That was touch and go, maybe, but it worked out. And then I want to say, well, I say this often, when I'm talking to law school students or college students, I said, not too long ago, we had a case called Bush v. Gore. You may have heard of that case. It was rather controversial. I dissented. 5 people thought that the electoral votes went to the Bush side, and I thought the other side, and so forth. There was disagreement, and it was pretty controversial in the United States. So think, that decision affected people, the decision of the court. And second, they thought it was important. And third, they thought it was wrong. Well, I mean, not everybody thought it was wrong. Half the people thought it was wrong. Or let me say a few more than half might have thought it was wrong. But in any case, what's interesting about that for present purposes is that I heard Harry Reid, the Democratic majority leader in the Senate, speak in the Supreme Court at a dinner we used to have for the senators. And he said the most interesting thing about that case The most remarkable thing is something that no one has remarked. That despite the fact that it is important that people felt strongly against it, half the country, and it was wrong. And of course, I think it was wrong. So, hey, okay. Despite that, people didn't throw rocks. They didn't shoot guns. They weren't killing other people. They more or less accepted it for better or for worse. And he said that is a remarkable thing about a country with 330 million people of every race, every religion, every point of view imaginable. All right? And so I tell that the students at Stanford, discuss it with them, rule of law. And I say, no, I know that as I speak about this, about half of you are thinking, too bad there weren't a few riots. Too bad there weren't a few people shot. Too bad there weren't some stones thrown. I said, okay, I understand that. There have been moments when I've thought somewhat like you are thinking, and you're not telling me you're thinking that, but I know you are. Turn on your television set. Turn on your television set and see what they look like in countries that decide their major problems that way. And then ask yourself if that's what you want. And then you see, because my audience for this is really the Chief Justice of Ghana. And I'm saying, but don't you see in this? A rule of law does not mean you follow rules of courts that you like. It means you follow the ones that you don't like. It means that you follow ones that might be wrong. I'm not saying there aren't extreme examples and so forth where you wouldn't, but please. And the ones you have to convince to do that, you don't have to convince the judges. They get a paycheck for being on that side. I mean, really, it's not much of a paycheck, but nonetheless. All right, but that's another issue. But the point is the lawyers too. Of course. The people you have to convince to accept the court's decisions and laws they don't like when they're made properly. The average person, people who aren't lawyers, and contrary to popular belief, of the 30 million people in the United States, 329 million people of that 330, they're not lawyers. I know no one believes that, but of course it's true. And those are the ones, the villagers, the people in the towns, the people in the cities, they are the ones that gradually parts of them were freedom riders, parts of them, and it takes time. It takes time, a long time. But if you haven't done it, you don't have a rule of law. And it's worth trying to commit. Why? Well, this audience, I don't have to convince that. Why is it important to have a rule of law? To have the rule of law? What I like to do to my college students who are now not reading any books, they just look at television or whatever. They look at these machines, which I don't know how to work. All right, but I said, well, why? And the best single paragraph, I think, explains why. And I love this book. It speaks to my generation. I'm not saying it's going to speak to everybody here. But it's Camus' book, La Peste, the Plague. And he's writing about a plague in Iran. But he's really writing about the Nazis in France. And at the end of the book, where he's discussed the plague and how they eventually got out of it and so forth, and some people behaved well and some people didn't and so forth and so on, he says, why did I write this book? He says, I wrote it because I wanted other people to understand the story of these people, the French, at that time, but hidden under analogy. But there's another reason, because the heroes of that book, they're doctors. It's a doctor, Dr. Rieu. And doctors are people who don't philosophize. They just act. They act to help other people. And we'll tell you the reasons later. But we're acting now. But there's a third reason. And the third reason, he says, is this, and that's the last paragraph just about. He says the third reason is because the bacillus de la peste, the plague germ, never dies. Never. It goes into remission. It goes up into the attics. It hides in the file cabinets. It's in the hallways. It's in the linen cupboards. It's in remission for one day. For the benefit, no. The misfortune, yes. And the education of mankind. It will re-emerge, and it will send its rats once again into a once happy city. That's why. Because the rule of law is a weapon, not the best weapon necessarily, not the only weapon, but it is an important weapon to prevent that bacillus de la peste from re-emerging. That speaks to me. Probably because I was born in 1938. And we have people in our, well, you understand. You understand. And there we are. That's why it is a weapon. And so what do I learn from that? I learn we go slowly if you have people in a country that follow a rule of law. We don't really know what produced that period of decades where they gradually learned the importance of agreeing and following sometimes things they really disagree with. Yeah. That's one thing. Slow, careful. Gathering in a lot of people, we hope. And then because too, and this is sort of personal, I had never been to Athens until last year. And I was there last year, I had to be there, and we were staying in a place where they had breakfast on a kind of patio, and you looked out, and you saw the Parthenon. And when I saw the Parthenon, my heart gave a jump. And I thought it gave that jump because I'm a lawyer. but you see, look, the Parthenon, that's Athene's place. And Athene is the goddess of justice and law. And I couldn't help but remember a little, not the whole thing because I can't remember it all, if anything, but I remember in the class that I took when I was once in college, and indeed I was once, and we read Aeschylus, and we read the Orestii, and we read how Athene came to Athens and stood there in her palace and stood there in her place, in her temple, and Aeschylus has her say, look, first, the Furies are going to go down to the jail somewhere. They're down. We can't get rid of them. See, they're sort of like Camus' plague term. We can't get rid of them, but they're down in the basement. And they better behave themselves because we're going to have a different system. And it's called the system of law. And what Aeschylus has her say is that justice, overcoming the avenging Furies, promises Athens that her seat, which is the seat of justice, quote, shall be a wall, a bulwark of salvation, wide as your land, as your imperial state, none mightier in the habitable world. Yeah. It didn't always work out, but that's the idea. And of course, when Aeschylus has her say that, he's really reflecting an older tradition. And the older tradition is just what you said, Mr. President. It's the psalmists. They say, justice and law are the foundations of your throne. That's what we stand for. Requires work.